Welcome back, everybody. This is lesson 3-2, where we continue to look at progressivism. Last time we looked at President Roosevelt. Today we're going to take a look at Presidents Taft and Wilson as progressives. Now, William Howard Taft winds up being the hand-picked successor of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had served more than 3 years of McKinley's term as president, and then a full 4-year term of his own. But after 7.5 years, he decided he was going to step down from the presidency. But he told the American voters, if you want a progressive like me, vote for William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was supposed to be the third term of President Roosevelt, and people loved Roosevelt. So they expected to fully love Taft, and with his support, he was easily able to defeat his challengers, the Democrat William Jennings Bryan and the socialist Eugene V. Debs. Now, President Taft winds up really seizing hold of the idea of breaking up trusts. Roosevelt grew in popularity because of busting trusts, and Taft will break up twice as many trusts as Roosevelt did, really attacking big business. The fear at the day was that these big trusts were always standing over the backs of our legislators and telling them what to do and threatening them with their money if the legislation didn't do what they wanted. So he wanted to break up those trusts, make them a little bit weaker. He never gets as much credit as Roosevelt does for this because it was, after all, Roosevelt's idea, Roosevelt's passion. But it was something that President Taft did, especially in his first 2 years in office, and deserves to have some credit for it. Other accomplishments during Taft's presidency include Congress passing the 16th Amendment. Congress passed that in 1909. It was ratified by the states in 1913. This created a national income tax. The income tax was seen as a more progressive way to receive money from the people. If you earned more money, you paid more in taxes. If you earned less money, you paid less in taxes. This way, more of the tax money going to the federal government would come from the wealthy who could afford to pay the taxes. This was seen as a positive step by the vast majority of Americans, and today it is used as one of the main means for our federal government raising money. The 17th Amendment was another one. Before 1913 and the ratification of this amendment, U.S. senators were elected by state legislatures. That is, you, as a resident of your state, could not vote for your senator. You would have to vote instead for your state legislature, and they would pick the senator. But this was being abused all the time, so much so that the U.S. Senate was referred to as the Millionaires Club. You had to be rich to get to the Senate. You had to be rich to get to the Senate because you were paying all those bribes to state legislatures. You were paying people to vote for you, either in political favors or in actual bags full of cash. The 17th Amendment then tried to address this problem by creating the direct election of senators. And certainly things got better with that direct election. Although, take a look at the U.S. Senate, it's still mostly rich people. All right, the election of 1912. By 1912, Taft was becoming less progressive, and Roosevelt, being out of office, had become even more progressive. So as Taft is becoming less progressive, he's siding more and more with conservatives in the Republican Party. Let's keep in mind, progressivism began with the Republican Party. However, the Republicans as a whole are starting to turn away from it. They're starting to say, do you know what? We don't like this so much. And they convinced Taft to come along with them. And Taft is starting to side with the conservative side of the Republican Party. In 1912, Roosevelt decides he wants to return to politics. He wants to bring progressivism back to America. And he ran to be the Republican candidate for president. That is, he ran against Taft to be in the election. But the Republican Party rejects him. They say, Roosevelt, you've had your turn. You're a bit too progressive for us. We want Taft. We want more of a moderate. He's our guy. But instead of just disappearing the way the Republicans hoped him to, he instead created a new party. Roosevelt created the Progressive Party, which was nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. You can see the emblem right there. And he runs for president as a third-party candidate. But what winds up happening is that Taft and Roosevelt essentially split the Republican vote, with most voting for Roosevelt. Roosevelt defeats Taft. But both of them draw votes away from each other and allow Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, to win the election by a fairly large margin. So Wilson becomes president. He's also a progressive, but he has a very important difference between them. Taft and Roosevelt went after trusts that abused their power, big businesses that were abusive with their power. But Roosevelt simply believed that big business was itself a problem. If a company was big enough to abuse its power, it eventually would abuse its power. So Wilson wanted to make sure that no businesses ever became big enough to abuse their power. To do that, Wilson helped pass the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Clayton Antitrust Act did three things that really worked in the favor of labor against big business. The first is that it made it legal for labor unions to merge and expand. So you could have two labor unions in two different industries, say, a cloth workers unit and fast forward a few years, an auto workers union. And you could actually have them merge and create just an industrial workers union. He also limited the court's ability to force workers to end a strike. It used to be that the courts could argue that it was in the interest of the United States for this strike to end, so the strike is now illegal and the strikers have to go home or back to work. The courts can no longer do that except for in cases of national security. If we're fighting a war and you work in a steel mill, the courts can still force an end to that strike. The other one is that it officially legalized strikes, picketing, and boycotts. Up till this point, they hadn't been clearly legal, but now they are. Clayton Antitrust Act clearly distinguishes that strikes, picketing, and boycotts are all legal activities. Another thing that happens during Wilson's time is the creation of the Federal Reserve. This ensures that money is loaned in a more fair and equitable way. The reserve is led by the Federal Reserve Board, which governs these 12 reserve banks. And through them, the federal government has control over the flow of money to local banks and has therefore some say over who the local banks loan to. If banks aren't loaning in a fair way, the federal government has the power to cut off money to that bank. All right, Wilson on civil rights. Again, it's important to note that the progressive presidents did not fight for civil rights for African Americans. Now, Roosevelt was clearly in favor of civil rights, but didn't want to take the political risk. Taft was also in favor, but less vocally about it. Wilson, however, was an open supporter of segregation. Wilson was a racist president, so he most certainly was not going to do anything to advance civil rights. He did not believe in it. He believed in segregation. He believed that the races were not equal. Collectively, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson did not push for civil rights at all, and this is to this day seen as one of the biggest failures of the progressive movement. Another interesting note on the progressive movement is the Prohibition Movement. We talked very briefly about prohibition last time. Prohibitionists believed that alcohol was the cause of a lot of problems in society. They believed it increased poverty, illness, unemployment, and violence. Businesses also supported this because they believed that alcohol made workers more lazy, less productive, more sick days. And so businesses and progressives teamed up to pass the 18th Amendment. And in 1919, the 18th Amendment outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcohol in the United States. Alcohol became illegal in any form in the United States. Now, we know that this won't last. It is another one of those failures of the progressive movement. But for a time, it was illegal to purchase or consume alcohol in the United States. I hope that you learned something today. I certainly had a good time with this lesson, and I hope to see you again soon. Farewell.